So, back in Acts chapter 19, if you'll go to Acts chapter 19, we're in chapter 19, verse 18. This is the verse. Remember, Paul is in Ephesus. We're in the city of Ephesus where they have this great idolatrous problem. They have an idolatry problem. There's idolaters there. Satan's false teachings are all over that city. So much so that they build at a considerable cost this giant, I'll show you a picture of it again in just a few minutes, this giant temple to Artemis that's 5 times bigger than the Parthenon in Greece. This was a gigantic structure that the city built so that they could worship this false goddess Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, the goddess of children. Some of you told me on, I don't know if it was Wednesday or Sunday, but told me before that in your Bibles you have the name Diana. And that's also the same goddess. Remember, the Greeks and the Romans had different names for their goddesses. And that's why you have that difference. One takes the Greek name, one takes the Roman name, exact same false goddess of Satan's Artemis. But this is what's going on in the streets of Ephesus while Paul is there. People are coming to faith. They're listening to Paul's message of faith alone in Jesus of Nazareth alone. They're becoming Christians by their simple faith. They have a past that they have to let go of, or they choose to let go of. And it says here in Acts chapter 19, verse 18, many also of those who had believed kept coming, and they were confessing and disclosing their practices. They wanted to walk away from the old man and put on the new man. They were doing what Paul commands in Colossians chapter 3, which would be written later. In the next verse, it says, many of those who practice magic brought their books to... Now, these are Christians. These are new Christians in the Word, new Christians by faith in Jesus Christ, and they are bringing their satanic magic books. Now that they understand how evil this stuff is, they're bringing their books, their magic books. They brought them together. They began burning them in the sight of everyone, and they counted up the price of them, and they found it to be 50,000 pieces of silver. This is a rich town. There's a lot of money floating through the streets of Ephesus. I made these statements last time. I want to say this again as we look at a riot that's about to take place because of money. Because Satan shows he uses the greed of men, at least I'll say, to stir up hatred in this city. We know one thing for sure, this is my statement. If only the believers, and nobody knows the percentage of all the people in Ephesus that came to know Jesus Christ, but there's an estimate among historians and archaeologists that the city probably held about 250,000 people. 250,000 people big. I don't know if you ever think in those terms that some of these ancient cities were big cities. 250,000 people lived in Ephesus at this time, and we don't know what percentage of those were turning to Jesus Christ, but whatever small percentage it was, only their books are the ones that are being burned, and they counted them up to 50,000 pieces of silver. Imagine how many magic books, imagine how much money is being made on the sale of all this idolatrous stuff. Worship Satan all you want. Worship Artemis. We'll make it easy. And we're going to see one of those artisans come up in just a minute and challenge Paul, who's drying up his business because Paul keeps preaching Jesus. More and more people keep coming to faith in Jesus Christ in Ephesus, and the businessmen who are feeding Satan's idolatry their businesses are drying up. So if more and more new Christians are believing, and we know that they are, Paul stayed there for almost 3 years all told, and all of these people are being urged by their brothers and sisters in the church, bring your books and burn, purge your houses of that idolatrous satanic stuff, then the businessmen were feeling it. Their businesses were drying up. So a riot will occur in Ephesus. We're going to look at that tonight. Satan uses the greed of men here to stir up hatred against the Christian church. And if it's hatred against the Christian church, it's hatred against Paul's ministry of Jesus Christ, crucified, buried, and resurrected. And if it's hatred of the message of Jesus Christ, then it's hatred of who? It's hatred of God Himself. And Satan stirs this up on the streets of Ephesus. Remember, God had already shown His power over Satan and the demons in this city when God demanded that that demon that was possessing that man speak the name of Jesus Christ. I know Jesus, and he spoke the name of Paul. I also know Paul, but I don't know you, you 7 sons of the Jewish high priest Sceva. I don't know you. But he forced them to utter the name Jesus Christ out of a demon's mouth. So God's already showed His power here in Ephesus, but Satan just doesn't pack up his tools and go away. He doesn't leave Ephesus. He continues harder than ever. He's a hate-filled, jealous, contemptible being, and he's not going to give up that easy. And so here we see him trying to destroy God's church by shutting up God's messenger Paul and running him out of town. Look what it says in verse 23. We pick up in verse 23. About that time, there occurred no small disturbance. Remember, 250,000 people. This is a populous city. And there was a large disturbance. No small disturbance is a way to say it was a big one. About that time there occurred no small disturbance concerning the way. Hohodos. This is the name of Christianity before it took on the name Christianity. It was called the way. And here's the problem. A man named Demetrius, a silversmith, a businessman, who made silver shrines of Artemis, was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. So this is the money man, probably the financier. He's bringing business to the craftsmen. And the craftsmen are making, imagine this, I would call it like a miniature of the temple. Like you'd buy at the gift shop, a miniature of whatever place you're at. And this is what they were buying. This man, it says, was making out of silver shrines of Artemis. Now this is the temple of Artemis right here. And he could have been making miniatures of this. He could have been making miniatures of Artemis herself. She's often pictured with an animal with a bow in her hand. Either that or she's pictured as a multi-breasted woman because of the fact that she's also the goddess of fertility and childbirth, etc. So either way, whatever they were making idols, satanic idols, to fuel the idolatry in Ephesus. And he doesn't like what Paul has to say because, as I said, Paul is drawing Christians, more and more Christians, out of the 250,000 population of Ephesus. More and more people are burning their books and destroying their temples to Artemis and probably telling their friends, you should join us and get out of that. That is wrong. This is eternally right. That's dark and this is light. And it's having an effect in Ephesus. Demetrius stands up and says something must be done. So he starts a riot of no small disturbance. It says, verse 25, it says, these, the craftsmen and the people that were making the stuff, these he gathered together with the workmen of similar trades. So everybody that was involved in fueling the idolatry is getting together. And he said to them, men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business. I love the Bible because it's so clear in situations like this. There's no question it's money that's fueling this event. The guy's business is drying up. And so he brings all these men together, or the different that are making all these different idols, some probably out of silver, wood, whatever people could afford. All these different craftsmen are in on this. And they're losing money. And he makes them know without question, you're losing money. This is not good for us. We have to silence Paul and this Christianity. Again, God had just made an issue of his power over Satan and demonism when the people in Ephesus knew that God made that demon speak the name of Jesus Christ. And Satan doesn't give up. He's a nasty opponent. And he's going after the church. He's going after Paul. He's going after he's fueling all this because they're losing money. Verse 26, he continues his argument. He says, you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, not only here in our town, but in almost all of Asia, this man is a cancer. We've got to destroy this man. In almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people. We don't know what that number is. I'd love to know. One day maybe we will know. What is this number of people in Ephesus and Asia Minor that were turning to the Lord? He says in almost all of Asia. Remember the churches? Remember the churches in the book of Revelation in chapter 2 and chapter 3? Remember where they're all from? Philadelphia, Laodicea, Thyatira, Pergamum, Sardis, Smyrna, Ephesus. You know where all those cities are? Asia Minor. They're all around Ephesus. They're within, a couple hundred miles of Ephesus. This southwest corner of Asia Minor was exploding with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so this man knows it, and he says it's this man Paul. He's the reason. This man Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all. So Paul's message is that anything that you can hold in your hand that's made with human hands is not a god. By definition, gods create things. They are not created. They are not gods. So this is Paul's message, that Satan's false gods are just that. They're false, they're non-existent, they're useless, they're powerless. They are not gods at all. So if I'm Demetrius and I'm in the business of making these miniature temples of Artemis, who the whole city worships as a god, this is the protective city of Artemis. She's our god, we are her people. If Paul is saying that Artemis isn't a god, he's going to dry our business up completely if people believe this. So Paul's teaching about Jesus Christ, the true and powerful God, is drying up the business of these idolatrous businessmen. I don't want you to miss this point. Satan's counterfeit false god system, and it's alive and well there. We mention Artemis, but don't forget all the other ones, Poseidon and Zeus and all of the gods. This is just the patron city of Artemis, but all those gods are being worshipped here, especially Artemis in this place. But the false god system of Satan's is alive and well in Ephesus and in other parts of Asia, and these businessmen have been cashing in on people's idolatry, on their worship of Satan's false gods. Now, I say that because I don't think the motivations of Demetrius here have anything to do with, I want the freedom to worship the God of my choice. I don't want to worship Yahweh. I don't want to worship Jesus Christ. His argument is not about the veracity of the message of Paul. It's not about, is it true or false? You notice he's not talking theologically here. He's talking about money. Our business is drying up. So when he's causing this riot in the city, the motivation that Demetrius and the rest of the skilled laborers have is not about, we want the right to worship our goddess Artemis. It's about, we want the right to make business off you suckers who worship the god Artemis. Remember, idolatry comes in all kinds of forms and ways, doesn't it? It's not just the idolater who bows down to a false god. It's an idolater who makes an idol out of money, or an idol out of pleasure, or an idol out of, you name it. If you're idolizing and spending too much of your time doing something, it's become an idol and a focus of your life. That's idolatry. It doesn't have to be a named false god. So we have two types of idolatry in Ephesus, at least two. One of them are the people that are coming to this place, sacrificing to this false god Artemis, and the other ones are led by this man Demetrius, at least in this story, this account. Their idol is money. And that's what we're seeing here. Very interesting. So Paul is the problem. The Satan versus God, it continues throughout the ages. It never stops. It will one day, but it doesn't until Jesus Christ comes back to throw Satan into the lake of fire. This event will continue ad nauseum until Jesus puts an end to it. There is an end to it. We can read about it in the Scriptures. But it's not today, and it certainly wasn't 2,000 years ago on the streets of Ephesus. Satan versus God is a continuous story throughout human history. Satan's always trying to get the better of God because remember in Isaiah 14, I will be like the Most High God. And this being is so deceived, I think you can only argue that he thinks he can still do it. He still thinks he has a chance to topple God. He tries with all his effort. His demonic hordes try every day to topple God. It's happening on the streets of Ephesus. He's still pushing the lie. Remember what the lie is? Yahweh says, I'm the only God. What's the lie that Satan came up with? No, you're not. What about Artemis, the great god of Ephesus? Worship Artemis instead of Paul's Yahweh. Instead of the Jewish Yahweh and Paul's Jesus Christ, his addition to Yahweh, we should be worshiping Artemis. But he doesn't care a thing about who they worship. He cares about that jingle in his pocket. It's clear from the message here that the prosperity, he says, our prosperity depends upon this business. That's his motivation. Verse 27, not only is there danger that this trade of ours fall into disrepute. I mean, Paul says the things we're making are not God's. If people start to say we're in an improper, immoral, unethical business, our business is going to dry up. That's bad. So not only is there danger that our trade falls into disrepute, but also that the temple, now listen to this, oh, it just sounds so wonderful. I don't think he means a single word of it. Just trying to gin the people up. How are we going to get our business rolling again? We got to get the people ginned up. We got to stir them up. We got to emotionalize this event. And that's why he starts. He says, but also, not only is there danger in our trade, which is bad enough, but you know my heart, fellow artisans, that if the goddess Artemis is not worshipped properly, it's all garbage. But he spews it. But also, that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless. If this temple, which was made with human hands, and the statues of Artemis inside, which were made with human hands, are no gods of all, look at what this Paul is saying against our great goddess Artemis. Now, clearly, some in the city would believe that, and these are the group that got stirred up, but these artisans aren't interested in that. They're interested in their money. But doesn't it sound good? The temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she whom all of Asia and the world worship will even be dethroned from her magnificence. I don't believe this guy could care less about the worship of Artemis. He says our prosperity depends upon this business. This is about money. Verse 28, when they heard this and were filled with rage, this is the artisans, remember the tradespeople, they began crying out. So now the word is getting out. Paul is doing this, Paul is doing that. They began crying out saying, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And I imagine this went out like, remember the Alamo throughout Texas, this saying, this motto, great is Diana or Artemis of the Ephesians. I'm sure it was spreading like wildfire throughout the city. The city was filled with confusion. Why are we crying out, great is Artemis of the Ephesians? Who started this? What was the reason for it? What is going on? It's a mob. It's a chaotic mob that's been stirred up. The city was filled with the confusion. They rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along the first two Christians they could find. Poor Gaius and Aristarchus got caught up in it. They drug these two along. I guess Paul wasn't available. And it says concerning these two men, Gaius and Aristarchus, they were Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. So they're friends of Paul's, they're clearly Christians. And this mob is going to the only place that'll hold them in the city of Ephesus. It's estimated that this theater will hold 25,000 people. We don't know how many were in it on this day, but it could have been that big. And they dragged two of Jesus Christ's representatives into the theater with them. And it continues. I think these guys were, there's no mistakes in God's plan, but they were just at the wrong time, wrong place, wrong time. And all of a sudden, they're front and center. What do you have to say? The people still don't know what's going on as they're filling this place, probably continuing to say, "Great is Artemis, the god of the Ephesians." They don't have any idea why they're there. This is a chaotic mob that Demetrius has started. Why? So that he can get Paul's message off the streets of Ephesus, and people will start worshiping Artemis again, and his business of his little shrines and his little idols will pick up again. Satan's clever, isn't he? Uses the greed of men to turn a city upside down so that the message of Jesus Christ through the Apostle Paul will have to leave town. I wouldn't want to be Demetrius in days to come. When they heard this, they were filled with rage. The city was filled with confusion. Gaius and Aristarchus are taken into the great theater at Ephesus. And when Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him in. Is Paul afraid of a fight? Not at all. Were the disciples afraid to lose Paul? Yes, they were. We're talking about days in Rome, early days in Rome. Remember the great Colosseum. I'm reminded of the great Colosseum in Rome when I see pictures of this. And yes, it may have happened years later, but they fed Christians to lions and tigers in Rome. These people knew this is a chaotic mob. You don't know our city folk like we know our city folk. And Paul, you cannot go into that theater. You won't make it out alive. And so his disciples, when Paul said, "Let me go in there," I can imagine Paul, the great disciple, the great messenger, the great apostle of Jesus Christ, saying, "This is perfect." Perfect why? Perfect why? Why? 25,000 people at once. God must have built the Colosseum, the theater, for such a time as this. Let me in there to speak the truth of Christ to this mob. Look at how much we could change. This is a great opportunity. And again, the disciples said, "No, you don't know the Ephesians like we know the Ephesians." They wouldn't let him in. In verse 31, it says there was another group who also didn't want Paul involved, the Asiarchs. These are rulers in Asia, not just common people that had become Christians, but these are the rulers, the Asiarchs. And it says also, not only were the young, fresh Christians saying, "No, Paul, don't do it," but also some of the Asiarchs who were friends of his sent to him, to Paul, and repeatedly urged him not to venture into the theater. Paul is ready to go give the gospel. He wasn't afraid of the Ephesian opposition, but the Ephesians knew better. And so they did not let Paul into the arena in Ephesus. It's interesting, because look what Paul later wrote about his 3 years in Ephesus. To the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which is the great chapter on, is that right? It is right. It's the great chapter on, I knew what it was a chapter of, but I thought maybe I meant to put 2 Corinthians instead of 1, but it's not. This is the great chapter on resurrection, where at the beginning of it, Paul tells the gospel. This is what I taught you because this is what I heard, death, burial, and resurrection according to the Scriptures. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 32, concerning his time in Ephesus, and imagine what's going on with this chaotic mob, these people, these businessmen who hate Paul and his associates and want Paul and the message of Christ out of their city. Paul has this to say years later when he writes to the Corinthians, if from human motives I fought with wild beasts at Ephesus, what does it profit me? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. I just want you to see what Paul is making a defense of the ministry there at Ephesus and saying, it wasn't from human motives that I fought with the beasts in Ephesus. Trust me, Ephesus was not an easy place to be. Paul calls them wild beasts, which is interesting because of the statement I just made about Christians being fed to wild beasts in Rome. We don't know exactly when that started, but I wonder if it started during Paul's days and he knew it. Wild beasts in Ephesus. And here he is in the middle of a chaotic, mob-filled theater, wants to go in, but he's not being led in. Another thing I got to say to a church who maybe wants to change things in the world. Paul didn't start this riot. The message of Jesus Christ, believe and be saved, is what Paul started in Ephesus. He didn't start a riot. Paul taught the truth. And where the truth landed, that's where he left it. The consequences of the truth among the citizens of Ephesus, that was the city of Ephesus and God's business, not Paul's. Paul didn't come in here. He wasn't a social disruptor. He wasn't picketing, is the word, the temple of Artemis for change. He wasn't speaking out against Artemis, the great goddess of the Ephesians. What was he doing? He was teaching the truth that Jesus of Nazareth is the promised Messiah, the Jewish Messiah that has come. I know him personally. He was crucified a few years ago in Jerusalem. He was buried because he fully physically died after uttering a great word, "It is finished," to Telestai. And 3 days later, according to over 500 witnesses, this Jesus rose from the grave. The tomb was empty. That was Paul's message. What effect did it have on Ephesus? All of this. But did Paul start this? He did not. He is not a social disruptor. The gospel of Jesus Christ is a peaceful message. I just want to say that because some Christians get out there and think you just got to stir everything up. That's not what Paul did here. Satan stirred this up because he wanted Paul out of the city. All Paul taught, the Bible does say, here's this man who turns the world upside down. But how did he do it? He simply taught that someone has been resurrected, come back from the grave. And because that someone has been resurrected and come back from the grave, anybody, any one of you who puts his faith in that somebody, Jesus of Nazareth, who believes in that person, the God-man, and his work on the cross, that anybody who believes that will not die eternally, but will also be resurrected. And the world wanted to kill him for it. The Roman world did kill him for that message. The resurrection of Jesus Christ. He says at the end of the book, when he's on trial before Festus and Felix and all the rest of them, he says in his defense, I am on trial for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's what turned the world upside down. These people weren't mad at him because he was picketing at the temple. That's not what Christianity is. This militant movement. That's not Christianity. That's not Jesus. That's not Paul. That's not what he did. The fact that there is a chaotic mob here is not Christian-led. It's not Pauline. It's not Jesus Christ. It's Satan and demonism and the greed of Demetrius and all the other people. Just wanted you to think through those thoughts with me. He did not disrupt this business. He simply taught the truth. He exposed Satan's lies. And Satan doesn't like that now, does he? He exposed Satan's lies. That's all he did. One God, three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. The Father so loved the world that He sent the Son. And after you've believed in the Son, God the Holy Spirit leads you through this life of learning, understanding, believing, applying the Word. That was Paul's message. It's still our message today. It was that message that Satan hated, because that's truth, one God, and Satan said, no, it's not. Don't forget Artemis, the goddess of Ephesus, and he's got them all ginned up in Ephesus on this day. It says some were shouting. Look at verse 32 again. Don't lose sight of the fact that this entire theater full of people, they don't have a clue why they're there. Some were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what reason they had come together. You know what that reminds me of? College campuses saying things like, from the river to the sea. And then you have a reporter say, ma'am, I heard you chanting this, and you've got your red, white, and green flag of the Palestinian movement. What are you marching here for today? And I have heard countless men and women on college campuses say, don't have a clue. What is it that you don't like that's happening? What is it that that Israel has done that offends you? They don't have a clue. But what happens when a mob comes along and gins up and stirs up trouble? Some people's souls are attracted to that. You know what? I'm going to skip class and I'm going to go do that because it looks like the right thing to do. They must have a real good cause they're fighting for. It's not a 2,000-year-old problem. It's a problem today. People are foolish. And the mob just got ginned up, and people were walking through the streets, I'm sure, on the way to this theater, and other people were seeing it and thinking, well, that must be the thing to do. And now you got a theater filled with people. They don't even know why they're there. This was one of the understandings. It says in verse 33, some of the crowd concluded it was Alexander. You know what he is? He's a Jew. What does Satan think about the Jews? We're seeing the hatred of Christianity here and trying to get Paul's message of Jesus Christ off of the streets. But now we have Satan bring up this guy Alexander, a Jew, because Satan hates the Jews too. Anti-Semitism is on parade here. Some of the crowd concluded the reason why we're here is because of those Jews. Because what doesn't a Jew like either after the Babylonian captivity? Jews no longer like idolatry. So the Jews were also preaching that all this goddess of Artemis temple, all these idols, you don't see that in Israel after they come back from Babylon. So the Jews would also be telling the Ephesians, you're worshiping gods that are no gods at all. And since they're crying out, great is Artemis of the Ephesians, great is the god Artemis of the Ephesians, some of the people concluded this must be against those Jews who say that she's not a goddess. Now we can read it, now that you know what it says. Some of the crowd concluded it was Alexander, since the Jews had put him forward, and having motioned with his hand, Alexander was intending to make a defense to the assembly. A defense for who? For the Jews. It wasn't us. It wasn't long before this. Let me say this also. This is a Roman city. It's a free state, a free city in Rome, but it's Roman nonetheless. And it wasn't long before this that Claudius, the emperor in Rome, kicked out the Jews from Rome. Anti-Semitism is sweeping the Roman Empire. That's why Priscilla and Aquila, the tent makers of Paul's, that's why they met Paul in Macedonia and Achaia, because they had been kicked out. Remember, I showed you the verse before. They'd been kicked out of Rome by Claudius. And here you have a city that as soon as they get an opportunity to show their anti-Semitic belief, they're in it hard. What does that remind you of? It reminds you of from the river to the sea. And as soon as the least little bit of anti-Semitism against Israel for going into Gaza and trying to destroy that hatred of Hamas, as soon as that started, you had anti-Semitism popping up all the nations of the world. And you think, wait a minute, I thought this wasn't a problem anymore. All they were waiting for was a reason, an excuse, and you see it popping up again. Same thing, the Bible says, book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, maybe it's verse 9, there's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new under the sun. Satan's hatred of Christianity, this new way, Satan's hatred of Israel and the Jew, that ancient way, there's nothing new. He gins it up in every generation. Here it is again. So Alexander is deciding, I'm going to make a defense for Israel and let the people of Ephesus know it wasn't us. Don't kick us out of your city. We didn't do this. It says in verse 34, but when they recognized that he was a Jew, because they didn't know who this guy is, but when they recognized that he was a Jew, a single outcry, all of a sudden there's unity in the crowd. There's a Jew, let's hate the Jews. A single outcry arose from all as they shouted for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." You Jews don't approve of our idols. You Jews say that Artemis isn't a goddess. We are here to proclaim, and they did it for 2 hours, our goddess Artemis is indeed a god. So, we refuse and reject your Jewish God. What's his name? Yahweh. We choose to worship our goddess, Artemis. And they made it very clear to Alexander and any other Jews that were there, we do not worship your Yahweh, we worship our Artemis. Satan had succeeded in turning everybody against everybody here. Does that also sound familiar? One of Satan's strategies is to make you hate me and make me hate her and make her hate him and make him hate that bunch and that bunch. Does that sound like exactly what's gone on the last few years in America? It's a satanic strategy. No wonder the black hates the white hates the black, or we're told that. It just keeps getting ginned up in the news. Why? Because it's one of Satan's strategies to get everybody pitted against everybody else. Because if we all hate each other, we can't have unity the way that Paul wanted the Philippian church to have unity and preach to them in the first couple chapters of the book of Philippians, all about unity in the church. You just keep people stirred up, keep people anxious, keep people bitter, keep people nervous, keep people agitated. And even in the church, I'll say one more thing about this, and I'm going to close. We'll pick up here next time. Even in the church, inside the walls of Gulf Coast Bible Church, the brilliance of Satan is at work. And you say, okay, what does that mean? I'll tell you what I mean by that. I tell you, part of his strategy is to keep the church not united. And one of the great things that he's done in the last 5 years is bring around this disease we called COVID. And for a time in this church, you had people that were wearing masks during church and people that were not wearing masks during church. You think that caused a division? You may not know it. I know it. I heard it. I'm the pastor. Of course I would. After that, the great government and this Dr. Fauci came up and pushed like it was the fountain of youth, this COVID vaccine. And there were a number of this church who didn't take that vaccine, and it would take an army to hold me down for you to put that vaccine in my body. An army. But I can't tell you how to live your personal lives, and there's a group in the church that did take the vaccine. You think that caused a problem in the church? At least a little stirring, a little agitation, a little ruffle? How could you not do this for the good of mankind, for the good of this, for the good? That's Satan, friends, stirring up the same pot he stirred in Ephesus 2,000 years ago. He just used a different thing now. In Ephesus, he used the idolatry, the Artemis. He used the artisans. He used the hate of the Jews and Alexander, their person there, the hate of Christianity and Gaius and Aristarchus. He just used a different stir tactic. All he did was in the same boiling pot threw some other ingredient in the last 5 years in the Christian church. It was COVID. And it was good. I'll tell you one more fact about COVID. We had at least one member of this church leave this church because of the way we handled COVID-19. Whose fault is that? Is it your fault or that person's fault? No. Whose fault is it? Who stirred that crap up in this church? Satan himself. Worldwide. People, vaxxers, non-vaxxers. You see it today in the news. We still have the problem. You have a divided political front where people want this certain guy to be the Health and Human Services lead. Other people don't because of his view on what? Vaccines. Satan will use anything, and he's brilliant at what he does. Again, don't ever underestimate this charlatan, this counterfeit Satan. He is brilliant at what he does. You cannot underestimate him. He never sleeps. He's always prowling around. He's always roaring. He's always hate-filled and enraged. That's not Christianity, but watch out for that guy because he wants into this church. He would, and I'm sure something else is coming. COVID was just the last thing. Mark my words, something else will come that will stir up the congregations of the churches in America. Am I going to wear a mask? Am I not going to wear a mask? I came up here the day that COVID started, and I said, listen, this is not a moral issue. It's not a moral issue. It's not an ethical issue. If I want to wear a mask, I'll wear one. If I don't want to wear a mask, I won't. But don't look down on me for wearing one or look down on me for not wearing one. This is an amoral issue. This isn't a biblical issue. This is a health issue. If you want to go barefoot and walk across glass, that's your business. I prefer to wear shoes. But that's not a moral issue. But I'm telling you, even still, there were repercussions in this church, this Bible-based, God-loving, Jesus-preaching church, because this Satan is just so evil and so good at what he does that even some in this church let it sway them away from the congregation of the church. That's a big problem. He's good at what he does. Don't underestimate him. Let's go to the Lord in a word of prayer. Heavenly